Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the first ever Housing Technology Symposium, co-hosted by HUD and the Terner Housing Innovation Labs. My name is Solomon Green, and I lead HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. We are so excited to be joined here at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco by dozens of leaders in housing policy and practice, including policymakers, entrepreneurs, researchers, technologists, and advocates. And we are even more excited to be joined online by over 1,000 participants that registered to stream the event live. HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge announced this event series and HUD's partnership with Terner Labs in June at the Housing Innovation Showcase on the National Mall. At the showcase, Secretary Fudge recognized that technological innovation is transforming all aspects of the housing market and the way people find, finance, and keep affordable housing, as well as the way housing is planned and built. We are so excited to be partnering with Terner Labs, the sister organization of the Terner Center at UC Berkeley, to explore these dynamics and trends and what they mean for HUD and the people and communities we serve. This is the first event in the Housing Technology Symposium series, and today we'll be discussing the role that technology plays in helping renters search for and find housing that is affordable to them and meets their family's needs. But the origins of this series predate the Innovative Housing Showcase in June and can be traced back to two policy statements that are guiding approaches to solving the nation's housing affordability challenges and creating a housing marketplace and economy that works for everyone across the federal government. In May 2022, President Biden announced the Biden-Harris administration's Housing Supply Action Plan to help close the housing supply gap in 5 years. One of the key pillars of the Housing Supply Action Plan is to promote housing innovation and new technologies that can boost housing supply and bring down costs for consumers. And in January 2023, the White House released its Blueprint for a Renter's Bill of Rights, which announced resident-centered, evidence-based, and community-informed principles to help ensure fair and equal access to safe, quality, and affordable housing for all. At the same time, the White House and Secretary Fudge also called on private actors in the housing market to support these principles and make their own commitments that improve the quality of life for renters. In March, Secretary Fudge penned an open letter to the housing industry to highlight best practices around transparency and rental fees. Today, we are joined in the room by 3 technology companies that heeded that call. Zillow, which launched a new tool to enable renters to find the total cost of renting an apartment during their search. Apartments.com, which created a new calculator on its platform to help renters determine the all-in price of the desired unit. And AffordableHousing.com, which will require owners on their site to disclose all refundable and non-refundable fees and charges upfront in their listings. We thank these companies for their commitments, and we look forward to identifying new opportunities to work with technology companies to improve the housing search process during the panel discussions today. Today, we are here to explore how housing technology can make the housing search fairer, more equitable, and more transparent for renters. This is not an academic or theoretical exercise, since we know that more than 44 million renter households increasingly rely on technology to search for rental units. As with every symposium in this series, we will be discussing both opportunities and challenges. How is technology making it easier for renters to find housing that meets their family's needs? And what risks does it present? Most important, this symposium will begin a conversation about how we can work together to accelerate progress on those opportunities and mitigate those risks. At HUD, we know how pressing our nation's housing affordability challenges are. But we also know that in designing and implementing solutions, we cannot do it alone. That is why we are so grateful to our partners at Terner Labs, our panelists, and all of you in the room today, as well as everyone joining online for being part of this timely and important conversation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Cara Murray-Badal from Terner Labs to kick off the panel discussions. Thank you, Cara.
Thank you, Solomon. Welcome again, and thank you all so much for joining us. Again, my name is Cara Murray-Badal. I'm the director of the Terner Housing Lab. It's an accelerator that identifies and helps scale early-stage ventures working to make housing more affordable and fair. Each year, the Housing Lab evaluates hundreds of new housing ventures and selects a cohort of 5 of the most promising innovations in the housing affordability space with an eye to ideas that also advance racial equity and sustainability. And I'm going to be moderating the first panel. Before we get started, I want to thank David Levine and the Howard and Irene Levine Family Foundation for sponsoring Terner's work on this series. Terner would not be able to do so much of the work we do without the generous support and trusting support of the Levine Foundation. I have a couple housekeeping items, mostly for the people who are joining on the live stream. If you're tuned in online, you can ask questions live in the chat, which we encourage you to do, but please send us questions with grace because we will probably only have time for a couple. Many of you already asked questions in the registration form, and we rolled as many of those as possible into the panels today. You might hear something like a question you submitted asked by the moderators. Also, everyone who is organizing this event will read the questions submitted, and we are taking those back to the ongoing work on this topic. If your question doesn't get asked, I'm asking you all to keep an open mind, because I think there's a lot we can learn together anyway. Now, for everybody, there are 2 panels, and they're going to be fast, just 40 minutes each. I want you to think of them of 2 episodes of your favorite mini-series. We're going to binge them one straight into the next one. We'll roll straight from the first to the second. I know it's tempting to grab your phones and do the 30 million things you have on a task list today, but that part is different than when you're binging at home. I'm going to ask you to keep your phones away. And if you give me your full focused attention, I will trade you a really compelling, important discussion on something that affects you and your family and your community, the process of finding and accessing stable and safe rentals. The first panel, which is starting now, is on how technology affects people who need access to housing units that are directly subsidized by the government, otherwise known as capital A affordable housing. I'm going to turn you over to Christy Economy. Christy is a research associate for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. She is awesome, and she's specifically helping to execute the center's research on people experiencing homelessness. Christy, take it away.
Alrighty, thank you, Cara. As Cara mentioned, my name is Christy Economy, and I'm a research associate with the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. So before we turn to the first panel, I'm going to spend just a few minutes setting some context around the search for subsidized housing. And we've spent the past few years learning from people experiencing homelessness, how they navigate the search for housing and other services, and the challenges that we'll talk about today have come up over and over again during the course of that work. So I want to start off by saying that accessing subsidized housing is hard. And that's the end of my presentation today. I'm just kidding. But that is the gist of it. There are different strategies for helping low-income households access affordable housing. One strategy is providing vouchers for people to use on the private market to cover rent and utility expenses. The Housing Choice Voucher Program is HUD's largest rental subsidy program, but even that only covers about 25% of eligible households. And those folks often spend years on a waiting list. And then, once you get a voucher, it can be really difficult to use. Only 32% of households with a voucher successfully use it after 2 months, only 45% after 3 months, and less than 2/3 of households are able to use their vouchers after 6 months of searching. Another strategy is to provide subsidized units that low-income households are able to move directly into. However, these publicly subsidized units are also very difficult to access. New stock, such as buildings created with low-income housing tax credits, receive way more applications than there are actual units. And existing stock, like public housing units, are almost completely occupied. When households begin the search for subsidized housing, they're likely to come up against many major barriers, and I'll highlight 3 of them here: locating units, discrimination, and administrative hurdles. So even with the support of a voucher, tight housing markets across the country with low vacancy rates make it really difficult to find a unit to rent. There's also often no centralized repository for available units, so folks have to put in multiple applications and navigate countless waiting lists. As one voucher holder remarked, "I'm on waiting list upon waiting list upon waiting lists, but at the end of the day, I'm still in a tent with Section 8. Landlords can also be hesitant to rent to people using a housing voucher. As one voucher holder commented, "A lot of people have an opinion about Section 8 vouchers and the kind of people that get them. That's where landlords are lacking in their own education." Discriminatory screening criteria can also exclude certain households from accessing subsidized units. These practices can further exacerbate racial disparities in housing access because people of color experience disproportionate rates of prior incarceration and evictions. Finally, the bureaucratic requirements needed to participate in the voucher program, like lengthy inspection processes and requirements for housing quality, can make it take longer to find an appropriate unit to rent. Households are also asked for documentation that they may not be able to easily obtain, like Social Security cards, proof of income, and previous rental history. There's a significant amount of paperwork that folks need to complete in order to secure a unit, and we heard from service providers about the challenges of getting people document ready. This is true when people first apply for housing, but then also when they need to recertify their eligibility for housing assistance every single year. Discussing these paperwork challenges, one provider commented, "What we find time and time again is that people don't complete it. They don't know how to fill it out, they're missing documentation, whatever the case may be, and they can't do it." Addressing this system fragmentation is a critical piece of solving the affordable housing crisis. People are frustrated. As one voucher holder commented, "I went through the training class, I watched the videos, everything I had to do for the Section 8 voucher, and I'm unable to use it. So it's like a waste of paper." Another person that we talked to with lived experience of homelessness described going into different buildings over and over again trying to find a unit. And when we asked him what resources could help better support him, he said, "What would be nice to have is just a couple of rooms where I can come in and speak to a person about available apartments and where they're at." So as you can tell, there is a lot of room to improve the search for subsidized housing so that we can better connect low-income households with safe, stable housing that all people deserve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christy. I think you'll hear this over and over again today in different words, but today we're really going to be talking about the good, the bad, and the work we need to do regarding tech in the rental industry. I'm going to introduce the panelists. I would like to let them introduce themselves because they're some of the most amazing people I've ever had the pleasure to sit with, but I'm not going to let them because we'd be here for 1,000 years because their resumes are incredible. I'm also going to focus more on the work that they do than the things that they've done, so I really, really recommend everyone take a look at their profiles online to read a little bit more about them because, yeah, I'm stunned by the people I'm sitting next to. We'll start on the end and work our way in. Eric Shaw was appointed as the director of the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, or MOCD, that's how we do it? Yeah, for the city and county of San Francisco in April 2020. Dahlia, a project of MOCD, provides a current listing of affordable housing available in San Francisco and provides a standardized application with real-time information about eligibility for a unit based on factors like age or income. Dahlia has provided a model for other cities and is being used in the Bay Area to create Doorway. Janie Roundtree is the executive director of the we'll do Casey next. Casey. Casey Crosby is the founder and COO of Pronto Housing. the first off-the-shelf affordable housing compliance software as a solution platform. In New York, once someone is chosen for an affordable housing unit, they have to complete up to 80 pages of complex and redundant paperwork. Pronto simplifies and shortens that process and makes it all available on a cell phone, while also making it easier for the organizations providing housing to stay compliant with government funding processes. Now, Janie Roundtree is the Executive Director of the California Policy Lab at UCLA. CPL generates research for government impact through partnerships with government agencies. They perform research across multiple issue areas to build a network of data to provide programs and policies that affect millions of California. Janie and her team built a predictive model to help people stay in their homes and also looked at the tools being used to evaluate vulnerable populations, specifically people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. Thank you all. All right. What we're going to do today is we're going to all try and look at our own organizations and our own work, and again, find that good, bad, and ugly. So I'm going to start off with a question, and we'll see who feels called to answer. Where is there potential to improve the housing search process and increase access to affordable housing? What role should technology have in those improvements? Eric, do you want to start us off?
I can start us. Well, first of all, I mean, the bio of the work of our team, Dahlia, explains everything that we do. I think, San Francisco is one of the first movers on understanding the disconnect between housing access and the role of technology in making that happen. And so, Dahlia was started only in 2017. But since then, it processes 200,000 applications a year. And I know there's still a lot of folks that ask about how it can be improved, but I was actually on my phone, I apologize, checking with my staff. The way it used to work was people had to go to every property distinctly and apply on their own application. They had to find out in the newspaper. So the idea right now is there is a centralized location to understand access to opportunity for housing. What are the income requirements? What are the sizes? We're now adding, copying Zillow in the private sector, especially during COVID, walkthroughs of the property right now. But I think the idea right now is, for a long time, I think people thought if you're poor and there's affordable housing, you should be lucky to get whatever you get, right? And I think that what we've had as a customer service model is not just connecting to those resources, but also understanding that you have choice about how you want to live and where you want to live. Mm-hmm. And then I think the most important thing now, too, is we've made some priorities around displaced tenant preferences or people who live and work within San Francisco. And I think all of us could say they weren't administered in a fair way. We defer a lot to leasing agencies with monitoring, but now we really can track the data, tweak the policies, tweak our messaging, do language access in a way so I just think that for the first time the government feels a lot more certain that they're doing something better. And I think that for even all the criticism or the concerns that come from the community, I think there's a recognition that we should have more listings. The question isn't, I don't feel like I have a fair process. The question is, I wish there was more of this, right? And I think that's a huge shift, and that's a shift that I know that all the other housing directors I work with strive to have. Mm-hmm. So did I answer the question?
Of course you answered the question, but I do want to follow up with you about, you mentioned something before about just the way that different groups interact with technology, and I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, and so just really quickly, there's two lines in a housing access report done by the Department of Planning, our Office of Planning, a couple of years ago. And actually, by race, white people are more likely to find a house through a website. Black people through family, Latinos through social clubs or churches. I forgot what the things were. But the reality right now is the technology is making it easier for government to track, but it takes a lot of infrastructure to make the social interface and the technology interface meld. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the idea of the app and getting the phone, there is the work needed if that's not how different groups navigate housing access and housing opportunity. So a lot of our work on the back end, as much as we invest in Dahlia, I think it says in our call, we probably invest 10 times more in housing access services and housing support services to make sure Dahlia is utilized correctly.
Mm. I think that's maybe a great place for you to pick it up, Casey, because you work with lots of populations across different groups trying to make Pronto work for them. So would you answer a little bit on that?
Yeah, we see some of the same things across different population bases. For us, I mean, we're a software tool. We don't think that the software is, a full replacement today, right? Because different groups do access things differently. But it does provide a good entryway for a lot of people who are left out of processes otherwise, right? There's a lot of people with disabilities who can't physically go to a location, might not have those same social support groups that can now access it online and are used to accessing things online. We also find that different modes of communication can help alleviate some of those technology barriers. So, for example, we do hear from a lot of people that, my tenants never respond by email. Well, that's because none of your tenants work at a desk job where they're behind a computer all day long. So they don't respond by email, but they do respond really, really fast by text. So actually, majority of the communication on our platform is via text. And another way to reduce certain barriers is timing, right? So many of these processes right now have to be done during a 9 to 5 time frame, and a lot of these renters, they're working just like we all are during the day, and they don't have the ability to take off without losing wages, finding childcare, some other things. Most of our users, we find 80+% access it between 6 p.m. and 1 a.m. And actually, we have a lot of really interesting stats on timing, but it does tend to be pretty late in the evening. Those people, we call application fatigue, when people drop out or maybe hear about it and don't keep going. Different modes of communication and, other technology can solve some of those and help bridge that application fatigue gap.
Great. I'm going to kind of follow up on the question on something similar, but specifically, what way is this technology harmful or supportive to different communities? Specifically, we got a lot of questions about chronically unhoused folks with disabilities, seniors, former foster care youth. Janie, do you want to jump in on that one?
Is the question specific to housing navigation, technology and housing navigation?
The question is not written as such, but I would love for you to jump in on that.
Well, I'll take a slightly different lens. My organization works on homelessness policy and less on access to affordable housing. And so just to give an example, I would describe most young people exiting the foster care system in Los Angeles, where we do our work, as at risk of being housing unstable. If you think about that time of life, they're exiting care, they're entering their adult life. They have to find housing just like every young person, no matter the level of support that they might have from their family or community. And these are young people with a lot of challenges and supportive needs for entering the labor market and as well as the housing market. And really what we're trying to do with technology is help the Department of Child and Family Services in Los Angeles understand, at least 2 years before that point, which young people in care might need a lot more help. So in this case, we're developing predictive models that can help Department of Child and Family Services in LA understand when a young person is 16 or 17 years old, which of them are at highest risk of using emergency shelter or interim housing when they reach the age of majority and are exiting care. And what that will help, hopefully, that department do is design more resources or more intentionality around supporting their housing search several years later. I did want to pause here because I think one theme of this conference is both, and the theme of the question is both technology as a solution, but also where it falls short. And predictive modeling is a great example, because really what our predictive models are doing are just helping the department identify a group of young people who might be at higher risk. But that predictive model doesn't provide the solution. And a lot of those young people, it won't surprise you to know, who are at highest risk, have a lot of behavioral health challenges, trauma, adverse childhood experiences. Their placements are moving around a lot. They have a lot of barriers to housing. And so what we hope our predictive modeling will shine a light on the need to invest resources in behavioral health care, intensive supportive services, and more housing models that come with services, rather than just business as usual. A lot of the housing for transition age youth assumes that they're going to go to school or work and perform well, right? So we're really missing a big gap. So the technology in some ways is useful for focusing on a really big human capital and resource investment problem that need something other than a technology solution.
But Kara, also want to note that there's not a such thing as housing. You know what I mean? And I just want to be quite honest. I mean, like our housing placement, right? So in one of our 100% affordable housing units, 20% of placements through coordinated entry, 5% are through the HIV housing list, right? Tay would go through coordinated entry, then the rest are through Dahlia, right? We have 100% PSH that go through coordinated entry. We have the voucher system that's managed by a housing authority. And so even for the mayor, when we try to explain that guy on the street needs to use Dahlia in housing, and we go, Madam Mayor, that's actually coordinated entry. That's not this. And so there's a moment right now that we're trying to find the technology language and actual language and flows to show how this all exists. And I think that there's also a disconnect, and I really thank you for the presentation ahead of time. A lot of folks with vouchers are only interfacing with the housing authority, but they have the income to use the voucher to go through 100% affordable housing, right? So there's a moment of people know one interface, and they only go through that. And our own departments aren't like, you should actually go through Dahlia as well. You know, there's a moment in the end of we're working really hard to do that. I mean, the other challenge in the end is 100% affordable can't do below 30%, right? So we're referring someone to Dahlia, but they can't. We have 120% units, 150% units, 50%. Like things are so bifurcated even within that system that because of either finance or these spaces, we try to be as transparent as possible. But when we say we built 100 units of housing, 75 are available for everyone with preferences. But even in that, 10 are available if you're 50. You know, it's a weird moment that like someone just doesn't know that. They want to go to Zillow, know they can get it, they're considered low income, and that's it. So there's a moment right now where it lets us sort appropriately to get folks in faster. But it's really hard to articulate to the general public or someone in need of housing, I'm in 120% AMI, or I'm in senior housing. They just see something built and a ribbon cutting, and they see Dahlia say housing's accessible. Mm-hmm. And so I know even for the mayor, when she sees both the rents and the spread, how can we make this easier is always the question she has. And some of this is, well, you know, it's financing, you know what I mean? Or it is policy, but we're really working now to reconcile some of that.
I see. So it's really like it's maybe missing that kind of human-centered focus where there may be a system for you, but if you don't go to the right system, you may never know that something exists, as opposed to saying, like, you're this person and here are all the menu of things that might be available.
Our things are chopped up more than you think. That building's not a building. That building is unit types by AMI, financed by bonds or LIHTC or this, right? There's a moment in that instance.
Well, and just to pick up and draw out, I think, a broader theme that's a challenge for technology and government in general is just the way that we procure technologies. Because really what you're describing is a large variety of funding sources or financing, each of which create an asset that has certain criteria for people to move in. And when you are layering in technology to access those things, typically in the government, the procurement and development of that technology is also tied to those funding streams, right? Which the architecture is really around how the government operates. The architecture is not how people experience their lives and their needs. And so there's a huge gap, you know, in government technology projects between the way they're actually procured and designed and the UX, the user experience or the human experience of trying to actually solve the problem. So I think that's just a sort of general theme to pay attention to and how these, starting with how the technology is even financed from day one.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And actually, Eric, if I may quote something you said to me earlier about like that we talk about what's possible and we talk about what's probable, but we don't talk about what's preferable. And so creating an experience that's really based on the user and also what people actually, the kind of housing that people actually want, which is often a gap as well. Casey, I'm wondering if you could pick up a little bit about, I mean, you as the person who is, or you're the one, they come to you at the moment when they've already been selected in the lottery, but I'm wondering what you see about how technology is changing, how people are searching for and securing affordable housing.
Yeah, I mean, the process is super confusing. I think I'm relatively new to the industry. We started Pronto about 3 years ago, and I am continually shocked at how many programs are on these buildings and the requirements and there are some buildings where, applicants and renters have to fill out 3 different applications throughout a year and 3 different recertifications, which is just too much. It's wild. But I think, technology, I think you're right, what you're saying about the lens. Since we are a private company, we're not a government organization, we actually look at it from what we call our end users, or our renters and our compliance users at the property owner. So success for us means success for them. They have to be happy in order for people to keep buying our software. So we do keep their preferences in mind as we're building everything, including how we communicate. We're continually adding more communication tools and videos and all sorts of ways to interact because people consume, data and information in different ways to help try to demystify the process in as short of a time as possible. We work with some housing agencies that will provide a nice video actually on exactly what Eric's describing. The video is 18 minutes long. It's great. It is really thorough, but they're not spending 18 minutes to maybe apply to a unit on a Dahlia or some site. So I think we're constantly getting their feedback, and we have a lot of different channels in our app to try to get that feedback. And we continue to provide it to our property owners too. And some of our property owners do work closely with agencies to help, give that feedback and try to make changes as well.
Yeah, and I want to add to that because then the handoff, right? So RC does not build housing. We don't lease housing. We administer the movement of housing. And I think even with our nonprofit providers and for-profit providers, no, they've been cleared already. Yeah, and actually, we have inclusionary units as well. But then we rely on the leasing agents to move through that. And there is a definite disconnect on communication around what materials are needed. So we give guidance. You don't need to have your birth certificate. We got clearance per law, so-and-so and such and such. And we're getting calls back. So there's a moment really weird where there is not the warm handoff. We give you a list, literally. We're giving you a list of 10,000 people that want your apartment. You're telling me that you have vacancies, and then you're also telling me that you're picking one by one, and then telling me the system's messed up. And so there's this weird moment right now, I think, intentionally or unintentionally, where sort of the private sector bureaucracy, also built on bias, is unwilling. They still hold on to the narrative that government's been the problem when we're creating solutions. If it is income certifying automatically, if it is giving you the rank preference list, if it is tying PSH, for PSH, there's a case manager associated with every person from TAY that goes into a private unit. The market and the leasing agents aren't convinced, one. And then also, two, it is really hard to be a leasing agent. And we're seeing 3-month turnover on all of them right now. So we've institutionalized the relationship, we've institutionalized the system, we've gotten everyone ready. We're thinking the private sector is going to do the handoff, and then we have to reset over and over again on even what Dahlia is. And so there's a moment there too where the administration on the private sector side is inserting bias, is inserting bureaucracy that technology, us as practitioners, are trying to minimize.
Yeah, Casey, I'd love for you to pick that back up. And I think you have a great vantage point of what the private sector and the public sector and kind of where the work is on each of those sides. So if you could talk to that a little bit, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, the problem that Eric's describing is exactly the problem that we're solving. So we help basically set up and design all of what's needed for that qualification, so that way the landlord doesn't have to figure it all out, right? So, each agency usually wants the same things. Everyone can follow the same script, if you would. The turnover is really high, and when you find people who know how to do this and have done it for a while, because it's not always well written. Actually, San Francisco does a great job of writing things down and documenting, but not all agencies do. So you kind of have to just learn on the job, and then people move on and change, and no one knows what to do next. But also these complicated structures, which are very beneficial, and all these new programs that get put on buildings add another layer of complexity. And I think that can be really challenging for property owners to navigate. But just to give some additional context, I mean, even in New York City, where they have something similar to Dahlia, a little bit similar, where it's a centralized place to apply, once that lottery is finished, it can still take about a year for somebody to move into a building, and sometimes even longer, right? The average is about a year. So that's a long time where people have been given, and in many cases 40, 50, 60,000 people. So clearly somebody qualifies in that list of 60,000. It just takes a while to kind of go through them. There are tools like ours that can help streamline it and make it faster, but there's some hesitancy to adopt sometimes because people are worried, hey, do you really know the requirements? Is your organization going to get upset when I submit this? Is it really going to truly match? So what we look to do is, in many agencies, we're starting to work with them closely, partner with them, and really get their buy-in before we even launch in different markets, and say, hey, we'll run this through with them. They're good with this, to help landlords feel comfortable and the teams to feel comfortable. They're not going to get in trouble with this. And
I'll just go real quick. The term lottery is a hard term. You know what I mean? Because if we know, once again, 200,000 people are applying for 500 units and your number gets called, you sort of stop looking and you wait for a year. But you're also 1,000 on that list. You're not 2 on that list. And so we found this moment sometimes that people are like, I won the lottery. Should I look for another house? We're like, yeah, if your income qualifies, sort of try that. Or should there be a lottery for coordinated entry and for TAY? If you have a lottery, then who should get extra points in the lottery? And so we've really been trying to understand how to watch our language, because I won't say hoard's not the right way to say it, but it is affordable housing in these high need areas is a prize. It's a prize. And so, am I making an economic decision, a conscious decision to hold out and hold out? But at the same time, that means you're number 45 on the list, 46 is ready to go, 45 is like, And so we start to see these backlogs by the psychology of, if I lose this number 45, I will never get this number again. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to also figure out the language and the process and the flows to be like, you're already income certified, you got a Section 8 voucher, can you not give up your number, but can you understand there's an alternative path? We really are trying to say now, walk through any open door. The mayor says that all the time, literally and figuratively, around housing access and opportunity.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of judgment around this, tendency for people to just hold on to their space. But I held 6 spots for the Beyonce concert just in case. And so it's a very common human thing to, when you feel like there's scarcity, to try to hold on as much as you can. Okay, Janie, I'd love to get you in here a little bit to kind of, as we've talked about the search and affordable rental housing process, but once residents are actually housed, what role can technology play in keeping people in their housing, specifically identifying those at risk of losing their housing?
Sure. So we do a lot of research on homelessness prevention specifically, and I want to emphasize that because there are a huge growth since the pandemic. There has been a huge growth in rental assistance programs, and the primary policy goal of a rental assistance program is to avoid eviction, and that is incredibly important as an upstream measure to protect against homelessness prevention. But what we know about people experiencing homelessness in California is that only about a third of them entered homelessness from a leaseholder situation, which means that 2/3 of those individuals were coming directly either from an institutional setting or because they were doubled up. Sometimes we call it couch surfing, but they have some kind of informal non-leaseholder arrangement. And so if your entire homelessness prevention strategy is eviction prevention, you're not going to have as big an impact on inflows to the street and to shelters as you would like as a policymaker. So that presents a huge policy challenge. How do you know of 2 million people in Los Angeles, for example, on public assistance, what 1 or 2% of them are going to experience homelessness? Because even though it's a massive humanitarian crisis, it's statistically very rare for someone to actually exit into homelessness. And this is where technology comes in as a potential solution, where we're using machine learning algorithms or predictive modeling to try to figure out who is actually at highest risk. And we do that by linking individual level, confidential or de-identified data from 8 different agencies in LA. So it's everything from the criminal justice system to safety net programs like TANF or general relief or food stamps, to homeless services, histories, public health data on substance use disorder, all of our emergency department and public mental health data. We link it all together, and we designed a predictive model to try to identify current clients of the health system who are at highest risk of actually becoming homeless, meaning high risk of using shelter or street outreach services in the near future. We've been feeding those risk lists back to the county for a couple of years now, actually, and they're running a prevention program. And what's interesting, and this I'll go back to my prior theme, this technology innovation, for lack of a better word, created an opportunity to fund prevention because there was a much higher level of confidence that these are people that if you help them, you're really avoiding homelessness. And you can kind of alleviate your concern as a public administrator that you're going to give out a lot of money and have no impact on your homelessness problem. That's the way the government has to think. So we've solved that problem, but now this unit has to go out and find these really vulnerable people who are on these risk lists. So they've had to create a unit of people whose expertise is going out and finding people and connecting them to services, establishing a trusting relationship, having the credibility and the immediate response to get them enrolled in the program. So they've served, hundreds of people now. And we're doing evaluation. We won't know whether it's effective for a couple of years, but the types of people enrolling in this program are often really at the very end of their rope. They might be living in a garage space with a family who is a relative of the actual leaseholder. I mean, their housing stability is very tenuous, and these people tend to have very complex needs. So that's one way we're trying to solve this issue of how do you know which are the highest priority groups to give public assistance to try to avoid that particular outcome. And it's not to say eviction prevention isn't also critically important. It's just that we need more strategies to reach this high-risk group as well.
Amazing. I know we're at time, but
we are.
Just look. I think don't be turned on by the shiny app. The process flow model, the decision flow model that makes the app actually is a thing that can inform policy and inform practice. And I think now to look under the hood of push this button here, 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 as a policymaker and as an administrator, I'm going, wow, I never thought that was the flow, right? But I think that for all of us, if we think about implementation of technology, it really is how many decisions have to be made by an individual, by bureaucracy. How does that algorithm move you from one policy to another? And I think how do we smooth that to make that a smaller line versus a decision tree of a billion choices? I think that's a space where we can look at technology as a way of doing this.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think if there's any theme here, it's really about that technology works the best when it's an extension of a human-centered process and it works well for the people who are in the system, not the other way around. So thank you all so much for bringing that to the fore. I'm going to excuse you all. Thank you so much. And I'm going to welcome up now Shazia Munji to take us into our second panel, which is focused on market rate housing. Shazia, as you may have also guessed, is amazing. And so I will let her give us this presentation and tell you a little bit about her work as well. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Kara said, my name is Shazia Munji. I'm a research associate with the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes setting the context for our second panel, which is about the role that technology plays in the search for rental housing on the private market. In particular, I'm going to focus on research that Terner and many, many others have done to better understand how landlords decide who to rent to and the challenges that these different methods can pose for low-income renters and renters of color. So property management practices vary based on the owner type. They also vary by property size and characteristics of the housing market. Smaller rental properties are often owned by individuals. We often think of these as the mom and pop landlords who may be renting out a small number of units that they inherited or purchased as part of their retirement, but who have other forms of income and employment. Research shows that they are more likely to rent units below market and are less likely to use technology, even as simple as a spreadsheet, in managing their properties. On the other side of the spectrum, you have institutional owners, for example, real estate corporations, for whom renting is a business. They are professionals, they have large portfolios, and their goal is to make a profit. These owners use property management software and technologies to run their rental business. This variation in owner type and technology has implications for tenant screening and selection. Generally, landlords screen applicants in order to find who they believe will pay rent reliably and who won't cause damage to their units. Landlords screen in many different ways, for example, by asking for proof of employment and income, interviews with applicants, running a credit or a background check, or using third-party screening tools. Research shows that smaller scale landlords are more likely to use informal and subjective methods to select tenants. While they often still do some kind of screening with credit checks or employer references, individual owners are more likely to favor what they learn about an applicant from personal interviews and home visits, and to go with their gut when deciding who to rent to. Larger scale corporate owners rely more on technology, in particular third-party screening tools that bring together data on an applicant's income, credit, evictions, and criminal records. These tools then generate a report or a score that describes how, quote unquote, risky the applicant would be to rent to. So what does this mean for renters looking for housing on the private market? While these methods vary, research shows that bias and discrimination can show up in different ways across the both more subjective methods and the more data and technology-driven ones. Studies of landlord practices show that more subjective assessments, like when a landlord puts more weight on their personal interactions with an applicant, can result in discrimination based on race, class, and gender. For example, landlords often make assumptions about prospective tenants based on their appearance, the way they dress, the way they talk, and the composition of their family, including the behavior and appearance of young children. Many of these assumptions and judgments reflect race and class-based stereotypes. On the other hand, there is also research that shows how landlords who make decisions in this way may be more willing to overlook something in an applicant's history, like a prior eviction or low credit, if they have a good feeling or have a good interaction with the renter. In contrast, third-party screening tools can reduce individual bias in tenant selection because the data makes the decision. If an applicant meets a set of measurable criteria, they are considered qualified, and many large-scale owners or property management companies will accept the first qualified applicant that they meet. However, these data-driven screening methods can result in disparate impacts for renters of color. Because Black and Hispanic residents disproportionately interact with eviction and criminal justice systems, the underlying data is skewed in ways that reinforces racial disparities in housing access. The data used by these tools often contain errors or outdated information, sometimes sealed or expunged records, and they're often misinterpreted. For example, one study found that on average, 22% of state eviction cases are ambiguous or false records. Evictions are also filed for many different reasons, and not all reflect wrongdoing by the tenant, and not all result in actual evictions. One study of evictions in Washington, D.C. found that in 2018, only 5.5% of filings resulted in a formal eviction. Tenants also go to eviction court as a way to assert their own rights. So withholding rent is one strategy that renters use to address building code violations in substandard housing, which disproportionately affect Black renters. This practice typically leads to eviction court, where the violation can be addressed. However, this then works against them in future housing searches because screening reports don't typically distinguish between these types of interactions. Furthermore, prior rental history data, which could help show that an applicant has reliably paid rent in the past, is rarely included. And most landlords are passing the cost of running these reports onto applicants in the form of application fees, which can add up to make the housing search process more expensive and more challenging. Our panelists are going to dive into some of these issues and more. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jason Pugh. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shazia. So I'm Jason Pugh, HUD Regional Administrator for Region 9. And as Shazia just mentioned, this panel will center on how technology helps and can sometimes hurt in the search for rental housing, and what can be done specifically to support lower income households. So to help us explore this topic, we have three panelists thinking about this issue from three very different perspectives. So I'd like to invite them to come up to the stage now. We have Ms. Catherine Bracey, Ms. Sharon Wilson-Janot, and Mr. Skelchim Kelmendi. Hopefully I got that right. Good to see you all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
So, as the previous panel just mentioned, and as our presentation just alluded to, there are definitely both pros and cons in terms of the use of technology in the search for rental housing. So I'd just like to hear from each of you what your perspective is on what does the rental housing search look like for most people? How do you think people really engage with the technology? We'll start at the end with Ms. Bracey.
Yeah, so my organization, Tech Equity, runs a project called the Tech Bias and Housing Initiative. And as one of the projects that one of the sort of sectors of the prop tech industry that we look at is the tenant screening industry. So I'm not as familiar with search, but know a lot about the tenant screening side of the house. And I will say that in that case, the renters are not interacting with the system at all, which is one part of the problem, which is the sort of disempowerment that the tenant screening process takes on when technology is driving the decision making. I think, the presentation we just saw made a really good point about and I want to be clear that, the subjective bias that creeps into some of these decisions is a problem. But when there's an opportunity for the tenant to make their own case to the landlord and have a face-to-face interaction that isn't intermediated by technology, and when they have some sense of what the landlord is basing their decision on, they're better positioned to sort of make a case for themselves instead of just being judged on a score that is not transparent at all. They're not given a report that says what drove that decision, and many times they don't even see the score. It's just delivered to the landlord. And also, by the way, the landlord doesn't know what's behind that score, putting them at risk for violating fair housing laws without knowing it. So I think this sort of depersonalization of the process may seem in many ways to make the process fairer. But I think it actually introduces a lot of opportunities to introduce bias in a way that is more insidious and hard to account for.
Hi. So our organization is a national organization that works with housing providers, owners, and developers and managers. But we also have had a long history of working with the prop tech industry as it's developed over the last 20-something years. So it's been interesting to see that interplay between the technology companies as they've grown and the technology has gotten better. And the interplay between owners, managers, and developers as to how they want that technology to work. And again, we're still in the phase of developing many of these tools. Many companies use those tools differently, but in the end, it's still on the owner, manager, developer to create that human intervention in that system. So it's not the data systems are typically used as one piece of information, but not necessarily the final piece of information. Most systems have become increasingly transparent, which is good, and but there's still a lot of work to be done in this space. There are a number of companies right now that are playing around with a number of really interesting technology tools. One, and you saw a little bit of it in the earlier presentation, ensuring that there's positive rent reporting. Many of our members are very interested in that, have invested in companies, have put venture capital into companies that are developing those systems. The idea of using a common application, so there's a common idea of general information that people are using. That's another important tool. And another innovation that's increasingly becoming used by other managers and operators and developers is this idea of effectively a rental insurance plan or flexible payment plans where people are coming in and saying, okay, maybe I'm an Uber driver and I really can't necessarily pay that rent up front once a month, and maybe my rental history shows that I've had difficulty doing that, but a company will step in the middle of that and allow and insure over that flexibility to pay weekly or bi-weekly or in other increments, which makes the process more accessible to more people.
Interesting.
And what I would say to answer your question on what is the search process like, it's really difficult. First of all, moving in general is a very stressful time. And if you add the fact that a lot of the folks who are maybe experiencing homelessness or extremely low income, they're dealing with additional challenges and trauma to navigate this, and it's already hard. I think especially then when we look at some of the major cities where it's a very tight rental market and the market is moving so quickly, it is one of those things that if you are not fast to move, if you don't have access to real-time data and information, the market is going to leave you behind. And that is one of the challenges that we see is oftentimes with the scarcity in units available, if individuals aren't ready and able to move very quickly, they miss their chance at accessing a market-based unit. And so, again, this is, I think, where it's a bit of catch-22 because we need technology. You have to have it in order to compete in this market. Like, it's happening. But then at the same time, we have to be really cautious about what inputs are going into those algorithms to ensure that we are now not introducing bias at scale. So again, I think this is a really good conversation to have, but you can't avoid the fact that technology must be a part of the solution in order for folks to be competitive in these markets.
Interesting.
And technology has the opportunity for both good and bad. It has the opportunity to start with, all it's doing is reflecting systems that are already out there that are human-driven. So it can either A, build those systems and continue to institutionalize them, or more exciting from my perspective is it has the opportunity for us to look at those systems, look at the data, and start removing those biases from the system. And there's great research in other industries, in the mortgage lending industry, in the employment industry, that shows that over time, with work, with human intervention, with testing and thoughtfulness, you can even remove biases. And as the earlier presentation pointed out, really take some of that human bias out of the system and make it better.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear, based on what now, 25 years, let's call it, of the social web, big data, the rise of the tech industry, the venture-backed tech industry, that we aren't going to get to this place where the good outweighs the bad without a lot of work on our part and intentionality and government intervention. So, I mean, I think getting to that place really requires, first and foremost, transparency, which, in my experience, companies are not really willing to do on their own. You mentioned the mortgage industry. That is, you're right that in that arena, the fact that there is sort of industry-wide data and reporting requirements around racial bias and discrimination give us an insight into what's happening in the market. They make it harder for lenders to discriminate. They hold lenders who are discriminating accountable. They give advocates tools. None of that data exists in the rental market, which I think is a place we should start. And asking that question, why is it that we have so much data about homeownership and mortgage lending where we have almost none about, at least at a granular level that is publicly available, about the rental market? And starting from that place, you really start to understand the inequality that is embedded in the rental market, which is a growing share of the population. So we're building a technology sector, the prop tech sector, on that platform. In order to get to a place where we can be thoughtful about this, we need to start sort of asking some of those questions. And also, to the point about venture capital incentivizes companies to be thoughtless in their approach. And so we also need to be investigating how we can find other sources of capital for companies that can incentivize them to be thoughtful, take a slower approach, be more willing to be open and transparent in order to get to some of the outcomes that we'd like to see.
It's Very interesting. Yeah, I super agree. That thoughtfulness in the process is really key. You also touched upon a couple of issues such as transparency and accountability, and to me, coming from the federal government, it also triggers then the question of what kinds of regulations can or should the government put in place in this space in order to to encourage all of those things, thoughtfulness. Not to stifle innovation, but then to make sure that there is some transparency and accountability there. And to a certain extent, this touches upon the entire AI debate. If you had, one recommendation or a couple recommendations in terms of regulations that would help guide this process as we move forward, because there are both great opportunities, but also great challenges and potential pitfalls. Why don't you go ahead, Sharon, and start?
Yeah, no, I think you raise a really good point. And this still is, we've been in the prop tech space for a while, but it is still evolving, and AI is going to take it to a very different level. Unlike perhaps in the mortgage industry, the Fair Housing Act does provide a pretty robust enforcement mechanism, both through the Department of Justice, and through private right of action. So there is opportunity to enforce, and it has been enforced for the 50-plus years that it's been in place. I think moving forward, you have also, as the prop tech industry and its intersection with the rental housing industry continues to develop, you have sets of standards and safe harbor standards that are through the National Institute of Standards and Technology and other standard-setting bodies that are looking at what should those safe harbors be, to your point, in terms of transparency, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of human intervention. We're going to be, particularly given the owners and operators are already incentivized, given the pretty robust enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, to ensure that they are not creating legal liability for themselves through those things. So it behooves them to follow a set of safe harbor standards that would that create those three things: the transparency, the human intervention, and the corporate governance. We are going to be in human intervention in any AI and machine learning type models in rental housing for a very long time, given the robustness of those enforcement mechanisms.
I mean, I would just say pass a national source of income protection, and that could be a good start. I think that would address a lot of issues. I think the space is actually super young as far as we think about technology in this space. A lot of the challenges we're still trying to solve are really around taking manual processes and just automating them. Like, I think we have so much to go when we think about technology in the space. We talked a little bit about using algorithms and predictive modeling, but I think we're still so far away from that. And one of the biggest things that we can start doing as we think about, as a government, as local jurisdictions, is really addressing the issue of fragmentation in our various data systems. When we don't even know the water that we're swimming in, it's really difficult to build products and solutions to get real meaningful change. And so I would really go to the basics of saying, instead of even thinking about all these flashy things and talking about AI, let's start with the basics of just ensuring that we have a common understanding of the data, the infrastructure, and making sure that we're speaking the same language across the various jurisdictions and systems, so that we can actually acquire and be able to achieve some efficiency in our work. And then I think, again, folks that have much more experience from a legal and from protections around technology, I would say they can answer that question. But there's just some basic things we need to do. And it's not the sexy conversation, but it's where we need to start if we ever want to get to that place where the technology and the work that we're doing is truly equitable.
Catherine? Yeah, I totally agree on the infrastructure and the data piece. I think to your point about enforcing the fair housing laws, those are very difficult for people to sort of enforce on their own, to bring a private right of action. They're even harder to bring against a technology, an algorithm that oftentimes the company that is building it doesn't even know what's going into the decision-making process. And so it becomes impossible in that scenario for a tenant who may have been discriminated against to understand whether they were discriminated against and bring a compelling case without knowing what the algorithm is doing. And so I think government, one thing government could do is really force the companies to be much more transparent about what the inputs to the algorithms and how the algorithms are making the decisions that they're making. I think that's been a cornerstone of a lot of the policy recommendations that we've seen around AI in general, not just in the housing space. And it's important to recognize that AI is not just generative AI. It's not a future state. There are artificial intelligence tools that are making decisions about our lives all the time right now that aren't getting nearly the attention that like ChatGPT is getting. So, I mean, I think that's a really easy one. Another thing, there's a ton of things that companies can do voluntarily that don't really require government to force it on them. One is just auditing their algorithms, taking the time to really see whether the results that they are, the outcomes of the decision-making tools that they're providing are having disparate incomes. Many of them are not doing that. And a whole suite of things that don't have anything to do with the technology that they could do to improve their outcomes. And I'm happy to talk about some of the good examples. I think that's one of the questions here is like what's really working in the space.
If I could add one more enforcement mechanism that's coming very quickly, which are state privacy laws. Here in California, you have one, and Colorado has one that's already, those two have already been implemented by regulation. States have now passed state privacy laws for which housing search will be covered in most of those cases that cover about 40% of the U.S. population. So now you're going to have both Fair Housing Act, which is very specifically around the housing search, but you're going to have these broader state privacy laws that owners and operators are going to have to be sure that their use of technology is appropriate. And I think it's also important, too, that there's two parts of this. It's standard setting for those companies that are developing these technology products, so they are transparent. They do audit them. And if you sit across the table from a software developer in these companies, they're very interested in being sure that they're pulling as much bias out of it as they can, and what are the things that they should really be focusing on. And you have standards for how they're used. It's sort of like the movement under consumer product safety in the 70s. People are manufacturing products, and they come with the manufacturer's directions on how to use the product. You need both things.
Interesting. Well, it seems like even among, different perspectives and viewpoints from within the industry, though, there's at least a recognition that there is implicit bias in the system, and that kind of a bias can then be part of the basis then of these sort of, the search tools that are then used. So I'm just curious to ask each of you then, how can you then, I think maybe mostly for you, Sharon, how can you correct for implicit or unconscious bias?
Well, I think you have to start with the idea is there is human bias. And to the extent technology is reflecting what is in the human space, can technology do it better? I think that's really the question we should be asking, not is technology biased, but can technology do it better than human beings can do it? And so that's really, I think, the hope that with some work, with continued transparency, with continued thoughts around corporate governance and testing those models and being sure that they are, in fact, pulling out as much of that bias as possible, that they can, in fact, someday be better than a human being. But until that time happens, there needs to be a lot of human intervention in looking at that information.
I'll give you one example, though, of how we're trying to marry the technology and the human aspect. So one of the things, we discussed earlier was around the barriers that folks have to finding housing. And the first one was finding a unit. The second one was around the discrimination. And so one of the things we're trying to do, for example, at Housing Connector, the organization I'm with, is try to do an end-to-end centralized system for folks that are in the process of finding housing, going through the application, and then the support they need post-move and to stay stably housed. And one of the ways we address the discrimination piece is we as an organization go ahead and pre-negotiate screening criteria with developers and property owners and managers so that we can lower the barriers that are usually there to give more folks a chance to access to housing. And then we lock those lower barriers. And then when somebody goes into our platform, which we partner with Zillow to develop, they're now able to search for units that not only match their preferences, but have also waived those barriers that they have. And the idea there is that by pre-negotiating that, we actually now take those levers that are often utilized to discriminate against someone off the table, and somebody's matched with units that they already guaranteed to be approved in. Now, it doesn't address that issue that you talked about earlier, because as you think about scale, one of the things you lose when you go to scale is you lose the intimacy and the one-off situations. And so what we don't solve for is that fact that somebody can go and then share a little bit about their circumstances to hopefully overturn potential denial. But to me, the trade-off is we hear so many times where, for example, again, those 40% of folks that can't find a unit with a voucher after 6 months, where they're going and getting denied over and over again and having to share their stories, their struggles to prove that they're good enough for this unit and relive whatever trauma it is. And for us, that's not worth it. People should not have to do that just to be approved for a unit. And one way, again, we're trying to solve that is by us going ahead and negotiating that so that that individual doesn't have to go through that process over and over just to prove that they are worthy of a home.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're all kind of, I think, agreeing on is that there is a really fine balance of technology and human intervention, and the right dose of technology into this process, and the right insertion point where it can be the most effective. I think there really are important use cases for technology in the rental experience. I am less confident that the housing system is ready for full-scale adoption of the kinds of technologies that are available, because the sort of social infrastructure is not strong enough yet. I mean, I think to your point about taking away the human, you can't do that. You can't have the human interventions at scale. Well, I mean, there are ways in which the companies that are providing the technology can encourage the person who's using it to have a human intervention, right? There are ways to build that into the use of the technology, and some companies are doing that. There are ways for the companies that are building the application process to provide the person who's applying with their application so that they can take it to multiple different providers instead of making them apply over and over again on one platform. So it's really, there's a lot of human work here, and a lot of just awareness raising. Like I'm sure there are engineers who are doing audits and being really thoughtful. I have worked with thousands of technologists over my career. I have met, not enough of them that I think have the depth of understanding of how discrimination and bias show up in the housing market in particular, to be savvy enough to understand how that looks without some external accountability. So I don't think it's enough to just leave it up to internal auditing. There has to be a broader role for society, for government, for all of us to sort of build the context so that these tools can be fair and can do a better job than humans have and are doing.
I like to hope we're not running away from it. We're not running toward it with scissors, but we are walking toward it in a way that's deliberative. To your point, these companies are going to have to get good at pulling out the discrimination because the liability is so great between them and the owner, developer, manager that they're selling the product to. So, they're going to have to get good at it as they're moving through developing these products, because otherwise they're going to be in trouble too.
Well, maybe HUD or some other enforcement agency could turn the screw a little bit so that they feel the heat.
If only there was some kind of federal regulator or administrative agency that dealt with housing. No, I'm just joking. That's actually, though, this discussion is fascinating, and it's a great segue to the next part, which I think, you're alluding to various aspects, but I'm wondering if, each of you as practitioners yourselves in your relative fields have best practices or something that you want to, like one thing that you would highlight as a best practice that could be more widely adopted in this area to get us to the end results that we seem to all want to get there. I think the pathway or the means that, you each might advocate are different, but what's one sort of like thing that any company might be able to do that's a best practice in this space to help prevent bias and discrimination and search, and particularly rental search, in the private market?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, a simple one is transparency. Transparency not only makes for better decision making, but also faster decision making. And we, again, have to think about the market that we're working in and how quickly it moves and how quickly a unit that's vacant will be filled if you don't take action on it. And so I think that's one area where we can be transparent about screening criteria, the process, the fees that are involved. I think that's a big one. And then I think the other aspect is the a reusable application or a reusable screening report that the renter, the applicant actually has access to. They can pay once for, and then be able to take that to multiple applications as opposed to paying, $42 every single time they apply. I think that's a simple solution. I know Zillow is currently rolling that out, and I think it's one that's cost effective for renters, but also I think it just makes common sense.
What's your recommendation for how long that kind of a report should be sort of valid for?
Yeah, I think, I can't recall exactly. I know some of them are between 30 to 60 days. I think that time frame between 60 to 90 days to me makes sense. I think it gives the individual enough time without potentially things changing within their earnings and things of that nature. But I think it gives enough confidence to the property as well that might increase adoption from their side. But again, that's just a guess for my part, but I would say 60 to 90 days makes sense.
Again, some of those technologies to do more of a common application show promise, but it's going to take a minute to get there. You have state law components, you have different investor and money components, because housing costs money. So I think that's going to take a minute to get there, but certainly there's a lot of openness in the industry to considering those opportunities and helping to develop those. If I had to pick something, if I had to wave my magic wand here, and this is a little off topic, remove barriers to building more housing in more neighborhoods and having a government policy that will invest the dollars we need in this nation to put roofs over people's heads. I mean, that is the answer to the question. We can keep pushing through and we can make these systems better. And already a lot of the technology is helping make these search provisions better. But I think as the prior panel showed, it is complicated. And until we have enough choices for the people that deserve to be housed, we're only going to make so much progress.
So you would support then, I think, YIMBY movements and sort of maybe not just reform of regulations that would make building housing easier, but then you actually have to go into communities and change hearts and minds as well.
It's that, and it's the resources, and that's a political decision that our country has not made. And it is, if we ever want to solve this problem, we're going to have to change our tune on that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that, and think the scarcer housing is, the more rife the more opportunity there will be for technology to cause discrimination in the housing market, and that's not just in tenant screening or search. It's in financing. It's in a whole bunch of other areas. So solving the supply crisis is a critical component to this. I think one thing companies could do today that doesn't have anything to do with technology, actually, and would get to this problem, I think, of not enough people inside the companies understanding this enough to do audits or whatever effectively, is just a greater sort of exposure and education around housing in general. You'd be surprised how many people work at housing tech companies who don't know what redlining is. So, I mean, this is just like basic stuff to raise that awareness and to develop a sort of EQ and exposure, depth of understanding of housing and how the housing system works and has developed actually goes a really long way. And this is something that we've heard from our partners at the National Fair Housing Alliance. If the people who are building this technology had a deeper understanding, we could preempt a lot of the problems we end up seeing down the road.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And actually, for the work that you do at Tech Equity, and helping to uplift that. Let's see here. We have actually a question from online, and if you're willing to take it. It asks if the panelists could talk more about the use of rent-setting algorithms and possible solutions. Let's start with Sharon.
Sure. And this goes to different algorithmic programs that have been used, and they've been used in other industries for 40 or 50 years around getting market data and using that market data to set rents, because rents are typically driven by market, both affordable rents as well as market rate rents, because we use a fair market rent calculation when we can all talk about whether we think it's perfect or not, to set rents and costs in the affordable space as well. Those types of programs have been around for a very long time. They will continue to be used in industries across the board, and using them in the rental housing industry continues to make sense. HUD effectively does something very similar when it sets the fair market rents. The question, I think, on the table in some corners is whether these are done in a way that is non-collusive or problematic, and that remains to be seen as regulators look at that.
I mean, I think this is a good example of where the information asymmetry creates problems that might not exist otherwise, where, people who have the resources to access and make use of the data about the rental market are able to do so, where individual renters, tenants, advocates, policymakers don't have granular data about the rental market and can't do the kind of analysis about the market that might be helpful. Now, it may not, it may not be a problem that there are companies that are using this data to set rents, and it may have been happening in other sectors for decades. But I think that these are the kinds of inequities in the system that, in a different context wouldn't be as bad. And I think when you have an even playing field around the data, it is less suspicious to the outside why, it seems like people behind closed doors who have a lot of power and money in the industry would be using this data to potentially hurt renters. So I think we should just all have access to data about the rental market, about what's happening on the ground, the same access that corporate landlords have. And, if they use that data to set rents and that's where the market ends up, that's where the market ends up. But there's no reason for us all not to have access to that information.
And I think some of that data has become increasingly democratized through the Zillows, through the apartment.coms, through other companies.
Zillow, will you give us all the data you have about the rental market for free, publicly available?
But there has been some democratization because people have access to comparative shopping and their ability to compare shop in different markets and different neighborhoods in different ways in a more granular way. So there is, I think, increasingly democratization there.
Interesting. Skelton?
No, I mean, I don't really have anything to add on that other than the fact that the way I see it is the system and the society we live in is market-based, and oftentimes that is what's driving these prices. And you see the scarcity directly lead to higher rental prices, which unfortunately then leads to increases in homelessness as well. So I think for me, again, I think we can spend time absolutely talking about that and talking about the transparency in the data. And the reality of the fact is that is how these decisions are being made by businesses. And I think at times what we need to understand is understand the business factors for the developers, the property owners and managers, and then be able to speak their language and come to the table with solutions that also take into account their business needs so that they can be a part of the solution. And so again, I think maybe I take a different approach to this. The solution that we try to provide is a market-based solution. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to deal with the fact that the lack of transparency in the data or the market forces that are setting these prices are something that you have to work with. But I think that's probably the difference between, for example, where I sit, which is around trying to figure out immediate solutions for folks today, as opposed to the need also for folks who are looking at policy change and advocating for broader solutions where they may be focused on changing the systems. And I think we need both. But from my perspective is, with that question, I take it at face value and say, okay, this is where we are. Now, how do we help somebody that needs a home today navigate this market and get a roof over their head?
Interesting. So we only have 1 minute left, and I just wanted to thank all of you for being here on this panel, and also to add too, on that point, we recently at HUD used both public sector data and private sector data to set those fair market rents, FMRs, and in fact, one of the primary people responsible for that is in the room here and Pete asked Solomon Green as he's running out the door.
The hardest job at HUD, without a doubt.
But, I think it's fantastic how, the agency is also embracing this kind of innovation and trying to find that right balance. I think you're talking about trying to find that balance between being driven by the private sector, but then also wanting to, balance it with our public sector, goals and needs. So please give our speakers here a round of applause. That's Sharon Wilson-Janot from the National Multifamily Housing Council, Catherine Bracey from the Tech Equity Collaborative, and Skelchum Kelmendi from the Housing Connector, national B2B organization that increases access for housing for individuals in need. So thank you all very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Do you have some closing remarks?
Only if you'd like to read them.
No, I was... Go ahead, Jason. We're just going to say a few quick thank yous after you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us for this very first event in the Housing Technology Symposium, the Search for Affordable Rental Housing. We're honored that you've all decided to spend part of your Mondays here with us today. And if you didn't get your questions answered, there are 3 more events in this series: Technology and Equitable Home Ownership, Constructing Housing in the Modern Economy and Next, and in the winter, Planning for a New Housing Supply. So there's a link in the description for this event to sign up for the Turner Labs mailing list if you'd like to be kept up to date and sign up. And that concludes today's events. I think Pete asked Solomon Green and Cara would like to say a few words in closing.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank again our panelists and everyone who joined us online, everyone who is here in the room. We look forward to continuing the conversation with those of you who have joined us in person this afternoon and continuing the conversation with everyone who joined online in future sessions. One of the things I took away from this conversation which was focused on how technology is used in the search for rental housing, but touched on biases and issues in access to home ownership and a root cause of fundamentally the lack of supply, particularly of affordable housing. Well, you all are in luck because in future sessions, we are going to be looking at the role that technology plays in the home ownership market, as well as in planning for and building affordable housing to address some of those root causes. So while we didn't intend it, this was such an incredible kickoff to what will be a series pointing out the interconnections between the connected challenges as well as the connected opportunities. And we hope you also will join us for those future conversations so we can find robust and lasting solutions. With that, I will turn it over to Cara to say a few last words.
Thank you so much, Solomon. Okay, we're going to close the live stream after. I just one more time thank the panelists. I would be remiss if I didn't say Pronto and Housing Connector are both Housing Lab companies. So if you are a company that's looking to expand and grow in the housing affordability market, let us know. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining on the live stream.